We know that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to a revamped podcast with shorter episodes that focus on 3 areas that I specialise in: leadership, performance, and culture. You'll hear my guests talking about their experiences and expertise, and we'll be providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. Each conversation will be accompanied by a free downloadable guide to save the strain on your memory, and resources that will make it easier to put the great ideas we discuss into action. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change, and I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. My details are in the show notes along with the resources. So grab a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. I am joined today by the very fabulous Rich Hanrahan, who's co-founder of RPNA, which has a real interest in leadership, its impact on wellbeing, and how they affect team performance and organisational output, which is a huge overlap with what I do at It's Time for Change, and which is why when we get talking about these topics, we can go on for hours. So we're going to try and contain it today to around 30 minutes. So welcome, Rich. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
And if anyone watching this on YouTube, if they suddenly see Rich running around, it's because he's been chased by a Hoover in a hotel. So I've invited you to join me to discuss a report that you recently published about the wellbeing of people across the government sector. But we're going to today talk about extending the report's findings and recommendations to the wider working population, because we know the challenges around uncertainty and complexity and everything to do with leadership and organisations is pretty broad across all working sectors and not just local government. But before we get into that, I just have to mention a LinkedIn post I saw of yours, I think it was yesterday, about starting the weekend like a rhinestone cowboy. So, and I have sent it. Anyone who hasn't seen it has to check out Rich's LinkedIn. Honestly, I have sent it to my family, Rich, and told them that we are recreating that this weekend.
I can't wait.
My husband, Morgan Lloyd, is listening to this. You've got to brace yourself. But that was brilliant. Anyway, enough of that. Can you start by telling me how this report came about?
The report came about because I have, as you've already outlined, a real interest in helping organisations improve their performance, and particularly in doing that whilst protecting the well-being of the people that work within those organisations. And my hypothesis, built upon some study that I did back in 2021, is that the single biggest impact that we can have on employee well-being is by improving the quality of the leadership that we provide the workforce. And that can be self-leadership, the ability to lead oneself in the face and know what's important to the individual to achieve their personal and professional goals, but really importantly, to help organizations put in place leaders who recognize that the best way to improve performance is a happy, highly motivated, psychologically safe workforce. And the more investigation you do, the more data you find to support that position. And of course, there are different elements in different circumstances and different systems that you operate within that require different of input and change. But we really wanted to just demonstrate that if you want to improve performance, reduce staff attrition, create a great place to work, ready for change, and delivering great results for the people that you serve, if you start with investing in the leadership, you can't go far wrong.
Which is music to my ears, because this has been something that I've been pushing against for many years. This whole idea about improving well-being needs to be a well-being program that stands alone, and actually it's about what's happening in the wider organization. And I think that's why when I came across your report, I really liked what I was reading, because it was actually, this is the stuff that really is the data that links very clearly well-being and leadership. So yeah, really good to see that. And one of the other things I really liked about the report, before we get into the detail of some of the findings, was your recommendation around don't get hung up on the numbers, but be curious. So when you're reading this report, just be curious about what the findings are suggesting, what it means for your organization, kind of creating that space to ask questions and discuss it. And I think that advice up front is so important, because too many people will go straight into almost like a blame mode, or a who's at fault mode, or how do we just fix it really quickly mode, without taking the time to really unpick what does this finding in this report for the local government sector, how does that relate to us, and what's our own experience, and actually being able to sit with and unpick how it feels for us before we try and jump into, how do we then move forward with it?
Yeah, definitely. We were really at pains to say, don't chase the number. Think about the performance which drives the result which you may have as an organization. So many of the statistics that we reported on in the industry report will be reflected in organizations' own employee experience surveys. And so often the unintended consequence of those exercises is that people start to chase a number. We want to be at least as good as our nearest neighbor, or as our competition, without necessarily thinking, how do we just make incremental improvements to the environment that we create for our people, which will lead to an improved number. And time again, if you just chase higher numbers, better results, but without really thinking about all of the individual changes that you can make to impact those results, you get sub-quality
Mm.
outputs. The law of unintended consequences comes into play. And as you chase one number, you find that you're deteriorating in another area. And of course, we don't want that either. We want, the rising tide to raise all boats when it comes to the experience of well-being and performance in an organization.
Yeah, agreed with that. I think too often people get so um, hung up on this being one team's responsibility, or one part of an organization that is responsible for well-being, who are then, their outcome or their success is determined by the numbers. And it's that I see it with the engagement surveys all the time, when people get the data and it's given to this bunch of people in this room to go, right, now what do we do with it in terms of making things better, rather than actually going back and then having the conversations. I think that's often the bit that's missed out
Yeah.
with surveys, is around, we've got this data, we don't necessarily just need to jump into fix it mode. Let's explore what this data actually means in a bit more detail, by creating space to have the conversation. So I really like the fact that you start your report with that emphasis. Um, so the report highlights key areas that create a real opportunity to improve organisational effectiveness. We're not going to have time to go through all of them today, but I want to just pick out some. So we'll start with this, and yes, it's a statistic, but we're going to discuss it. 88% of frontline staff want to contribute more, which is like an incredibly high number, and obviously highlights a real untapped resource. So how do you see organizations actually seeking what employees want to get involved with, want to contribute to? Like, what? Tell us a bit more about your thoughts around that, Rich.
Well, we were actually as surprised as many of the sector leaders that we've spoken to since the report came out, when we read the data, and we went back and looked at some of the freehand responses as well, to see whether they bore out the same statistics. And I think we, in the public sector in particular, we have rising demand, we have reducing budgets, and we have this constraint where everybody is very busy managing today. And what we found from the staff was they were willing to take on more. They were far more open to change than many would have believed before reading the report and considering the feedback. But in the busyness of every day, there was no opportunity to stop and say, what more could we be doing? How could we be doing things differently? What opportunities are there for us to improve the experience of the service that we provide to citizens and the way that we work internally with one another?
Mm,
And there were misalignments between departments. There was willingness for people to support in procedural and policy change, but in particular, frontline staff just weren't being asked often enough, if at all, to get involved in those conversations. And yet, overwhelmingly, these people that come into work day after day and do a critical job for citizens in their localities want to have a really positive impact on the people they serve and have great ideas because they are operating within the dysfunctional system every day and
mm,
they can see opportunities for improvement. And if you can get small groups of people together from across different departments or from different parts of a customer or a patient journey, you can very quickly start to identify opportunities to do things differently. And in company to that, 88% of people want to do more. There
mm.
was this really high openness to change as well. And it's another statistic that we consistently hear is people are resistant to change. That's not necessarily borne out when you start to dig into studies and when you start to understand what people really say. They're not a fan of poorly executed, poorly communicated, poorly delivered change that makes their life more difficult. But if you engage them in the process, seek opportunities to do things differently, to do things better, then people are full of ideas and they're willing to give their time and their effort to bring those things to pass as well.
I couldn't agree more. And it always puts a smile on my face when I'm working with organizations around change. And I remember a colleague of mine called Amanda Page from many years ago um, introduced me to an exercise about past, present, future of your team or your organization. And whenever I do that with a company, the amount of information that comes out from the people who are literally given the space to talk about what life's been like in the past in the company, what we want to leave in the past, what's the good stuff that we've forgotten about, we want to bring with us, and where are we now, what is working, what isn't working, and how do we change it shifting forward. You're suddenly giving people a sense of they've got a voice, they've got a sense of control. Yes, it's changing things, but it's changing things for the better because it's changing stuff that they're getting frustrated with day to day. And the lovely, always the highlight for me is when people say, actually, yeah, I want this to change. I want that to be shaped differently. If we could do this over here, it would make a massive difference to how I feel day to day trying to get the work done. And then when we ask people to volunteer and say, right, who wants to take on exploring that little bit and that little bit, which is obviously more time for them, you always get the sense of enthusiasm and people from across different teams saying, well, actually, let's work together and develop this aspect of practice, or let's kind of really fine tune that, or let's work out why this is a particular blocker. And you've got people within your organization solving their own problems and leading their own change, which is nothing more motivating than that, I don't think.
No, I agree. People have so many of the answers if we just give them the space
Yeah.
and the time, which is difficult, but the value in well managed engagement with frontline workforce is well with the workforce at all levels of an organization, but particularly those that are involved in the execution of the tasks you are asking people to complete. They can so often see better ways
Yeah.
to get things done at lower cost and with and greater effectiveness.
I suspect that you've just mentioned the word again, space and time. And I suspect this is going to be a kind of key theme underpinning this whole conversation around creating the space and time to think about how we're doing things and what could be better and what doesn't work, rather than trying to chase after the next shiny new initiative to try and plug a gap or make things better. Um, okay, so can I move on to another
You
statistic?
definitely can.
Okay, so 69% of frontline staff don't feel emotionally safe with their first line manager. Wowzers.
Yeah, can't be fun, can it?
No.
It can't be a fun environment to go in. I think for me, this really shone a light on one of the challenges that we see across organizations, irrespective of sector. It would be easy to jump to saying we know the answer. I'm not sure we know exactly what the answer to this one is, but I think we saw from the data from some associated answers and also from, again, the freehand responses, we got some really good indicators of what was going on here. Interestingly, um, I think there are a couple of things going on around emotional safety. I quite often talk to people that I work with about compassionate accountability. People don't create psychological safety because they think, I didn't think I was going to get woke into this conversation, but people have, oh, it's wokery, psychological safety. What are you talking about? When we're talking about creating an environment where those people we were just talking about who do great work, who have the ability to improve your organization, can put their hand up and speak truth to power in a respectful way. And I always look at psychological safety and say, look, the onus on the frontline manager to create that for their staff is that if they create that, they will get great feedback that will in turn make their jobs easier. The obligation that goes with it that stops it from being some modern term is that you have this sense of compassionate accountability, which is if you bring a problem to me and there is a way to solve it which involves you, then the onus is on you to then share the responsibility of making things better together. So if we have a cultural issue in our team, the onus is not on the team leader to change the culture because they are going to be but one of 10 or 11 people. The onus goes back to the team to say, as the team leader, I recognize there are things we could be doing better. Let's work together. Let's create a little bit of time and space. We're not talking about a week-long offsite here, but let's create, 15 minutes 3 times a week to talk about team behaviors or how we're performing together or the thing that we said we wanted to improve and then drive that forwards. And those little steps, those little interventions are things which start to create an environment where people can feel more emotionally safe, more psychologically safe. And there is ample evidence that in an environment where people feel safe to speak up, to make recommendations, to challenge, and then they see a change or they receive feedback on whether or not they're correct, whether or not there is an opportunity to improve, whether it's a great idea, but we can't do something right now, you start to change the culture and you create safety because people feel seen, they feel heard, they feel acknowledged. And coming back to this idea of people wanting to feel valued and to have purpose in the work that they do, they feel that they have contributed to the outcomes that they're working towards.
Yeah, I get that. I was just thinking as you're talking then about, one of the big challenges I see time and time again is that managers are not given enough time to do the people side of their job. And it's almost like they have got their head down trying to achieve whatever specific outcomes they believe that they are supposed to be focusing on. And it often isn't about creating the time and space to have those kinds of conversations. And one of my first questions to any manager is about actually how do you break down your time in terms of how much time do you have having those check-ins with people and having those conversations as a team. And the other fear factor is kind of the bit that gets in the way for a lot of people. I don't have all the answers. I don't want to know everyone's problems because I don't know how to solve them all. So let's keep them underground. But actually, when you talk about the kind of emotional safety, and I loved your explanation of actually putting it back to the team, it becomes a team responsibility. The manager doesn't have to have all the answers. It's about the manager can create the space to open up the conversation for people to solve the problems themselves. And it's suddenly you can see managers thinking, oh, that sounds much easier. But it does require that space.
It really does. And I think there are two elements there. There is the leader definitely not needing to have the answer. We have this cultural problem. in I'll just blanket it with Western society of the heroic or charismatic leader born out of uh, years of modernization of the workforce, and everyone looks to the heroic chief executive or the heroic leader that changes and leads an organization. And yet the best leaders, time and time again, are curious, they ask questions, they demonstrate the fact that they don't have all the answers, but they want to hear. So
Mm.
again, giving people the opportunity to feedback, giving people the opportunity to contribute, enables them to gain insight that enables them to go away and consider better decisions and outcomes. So you don't need to have all the answers. And I think when we don't invest in frontline managers, we promote them into positions of positional responsibility, and we give them authority, but no real investment in how they're going to execute and wield that newfound power. They feel they have to have all the answers. So they shut down conversation, and they shut down dissent, and they shut down anything which doesn't look like they are leading in the model which they have in their head. And I think that is definitely a problem. And then coming back to this idea of, if you're one person and you increase the output, your output by 10% of the overall team output, it makes so little difference. But if you're one leader and you can increase the performance and the output of the 10 people in your team, it has a noticeable difference. And if you can do that in any sphere, whether that be culture, whether it be the way people communicate, whether it be the service that you offer, whether it be the way you interact, you can transform an organization by creating that time and space to invest in the people that you lead.
I,
And it's just, if you think about it in pure numbers, each of those people, if each of those people have the ability to improve their output by 10 widgets, and you can move all those 10 people forward, you can create 100. If the maximum you can do yourself is improve your performance by 10 widgets, just head down yourself. You cannot move the dial for your team. So whether those widgets are, throughput of contacts, emails, manufacturing, I mean, it just doesn't matter what it is.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
the opportunity by investing in your people as a leader is just
yeah.
it's just disproportionately great when you really focus on the people that you are there to lead.
So you just mentioned about communication, and we're both completely aligned about the fact that people need to have space to have conversations. But one of your other statistics that came up was about 82% of frontline employees feel conflicts are not effectively managed. And I guess it's probably no surprise because people tend to try to avoid anything that feels like conflict often, or don't necessarily have the confidence or the skills to know how to engage with that. What did you find around that, Rich?
Well, it was interesting. We found a couple of things relating to conflict. Firstly, the data. When you hear conflict resolution, you immediately think that the entire workforce is at war,
Yeah.
and we need to dive in and we need to fix. When we again looked at some of the freehand responses and started to consider some of the things that people were actually saying, there were two things that were manifesting. One was there was conflict in teams and between teams, absolutely. And there are things we can do about that, and we'll come back to. But there was also conflict in terms of priorities, and people were referring to that and the inability, again, of the people that they reported to, who were maybe not trained to or maybe disempowered to help their teams reprioritize their workload in the face of increased demand, reducing budgets, constrained resources. And again, these subjects all kind of start to coalesce around, you have to look at the system, not just the individual. This is not a case of saying, well, we've seen some statistics and actually, we don't manage conflict very well, and we're not creating psychological safety, and there might be an opportunity for us to improve the investment we make in training. You have to kind of look at the system.
Mm,
And we saw, by looking at some of the organizational data, we were able, in the way that we collected the data, to look across organizations and to look across functions where those things were provided, not individual organizations, but across organization types. And we could see certain themes starting to evolve from certain areas. I think in terms of resolution, it really helps to start with a lot of conflict in the workplace starts because people actually care,
Mm,
particularly in value-driven, service-driven organizations. You know, some of the conflict that we encounter in change programs when there's a bit of resistance is because people don't understand how the proposed change is going to make either their life better or the life of the people that they are providing a service to better. And that's particularly true in the caring professions, in healthcare or in adult social care and children's social care. You really see these things come to bear because people care deeply. And so you mentioned communication, and it is about how well have we communicated initially to understand, to eliminate the possibility or
mm,
certainly reduce the possibility of conflict. And then when conflict does grow, the experience of the people that are required to resolve, to either mediate or negotiate or to lead, you know, are leaders within teams clearly aligned? Do we have organizational congruence? Do we have conflicting targets and objectives that exist? We have to get behind the fact we have some conflict before we start trying to resolve the conflict. If we just try to get agreement and we don't fix the cause, we might take the rub off the symptoms. You know, we might be able to stop people shouting at one another whilst they're sat at their desks, but we're not going to eliminate that problem. And
mm,
so again, there are a number of interventions that when we looked at this data, we were like, oh my goodness, that sounds awful. But actually, when you started to dig a little bit deeper, you could see that actually a lot of these things were driven by a desire to do things better, to deliver better outcomes for
mm,
people. There was a frustration either with other teams or with other organizations or with people doing different parts of the same process within a team that were giving rise to conflict that in some cases, sure enough, is about people and behaviors
mm,
and hurt and offense that has been caused.
mm,
But more often than not, in the work that we do, we see that actually this is a systemic conflict. It's misaligned outcomes. And
mm.
if we just go behind the team a little bit, understand what's actually happening, the resolution of that conflict kind of takes care of itself because all of a sudden, people that care about the outcomes can start working neatly together and interfacing well together again. Now, that's not to say that at times there aren't needs for intervention and for professional mediation and negotiation, but I think those occasions are far less common than we might initially believe when we look at data that says 82% of people don't think conflict is well managed. I think it's often not the headline conflict. What they mean is the causes of conflict are not being managed and resolved and
Yeah.
reduced.
And of course, we know that when people are stressed and they're working in an organization where things are not going as well as they could, so for example, people are using there are processes or systems that are just out of date or there are bottlenecks or people aren't enabled to work in their best way, they get frustrated. And then you put a bunch of frustrated people together and conflicts can emerge just because there's a sense of frustration at the system, not with each other. But of course, it comes across as being something between people because that's how we express ourselves. I thought your point was spot on around it's about conflicting tensions because it reminded me of a workshop I did recently with a couple of groups of managers around stress. But actually, the whole focus of it was on conflicting tensions in their organization where they've got perhaps more than those middle managers have managers from different parts of the organization who've got competing demands and it didn't feel like people were necessarily understanding what was on someone's shoulders and it was too much because people aren't joining all the dots. So that sense of looking at your this whole system in terms of what's creating the stress and where the conflict's coming from, rather than trying to work on the other end of actually how do we speak nicely to each other, which is what often people think. And actually, I'm also a real fan of, in terms of healthy disagreement, getting people to rename conflict. So conflict as a word is something that evokes kind of negative association and negative emotion, then call it something else. If it's something you want to actively encourage people to disagree and have different viewpoints and kind of unpick things and offer different perspectives, then actually maybe call it something different. So you're actively inviting healthy disagreement, and that's something that managers can definitely do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the worst things you can do, and you touched on it there, if we're all talking to politely to one another, and we think we don't have conflict, one of the worst things you can do is push disagreement underground. It
Yeah,
becomes toxic, it infects the
yeah,
system, it's beneath the surface, and leaders typically then will not see it until it is too late. And then you are at the stage where you've got massive damage to repair, or you've got grievances which are expensive to manage and time consuming to manage, not to mention the personal strain on the individuals in that grievance, the people that have to manage the grievance. I mean, just the whole thing.
yeah.
So creating an environment, it comes back to that. Have I created a psychologically safe environment where conflict can be invited, is welcomed, where we sit down and we talk about disagreements, we understand what goes before them and what might need to change? It results in a completely different organizational environment that means you don't need to get into the ineffective resolution of conflict. You're more in the conflict identification and then resolution in terms of system, not individual. But yeah, look, some conflict is always going to occur. We all carry, we've come onto this call in a good mood.
Yeah,
It would be very easy for one of us to be a little bit, off par today, and that could result in a slightly disjointed conversation that then results in a bit of disappointment, and then there's a little bit of conflict. But if we always assume positive intent in every community, if we can do that as a principle within a team, it's one of the things I've always talked to managers that have worked for me. Assume positive intent in the people that you work for, operate with positive intent. If you have something to say that needs to be said, go and say it in a professional and engaging fashion that empowers and builds up the person that you need to correct. If you can build that environment and build that culture in your teams, in your organization, then you're halfway there. If you can get 5 or 6 principles that just frame the way that you behave, you interact, and you perform, then even when there is something that's a bit off, people can put it down quite easily. They don't need to carry it around, or they can put it down more easily.
agreed. Agreed. Listen, you came up with there were so many more headlines in your report about 60% of under 35, so they don't feel valued for their work. There was 40% are positive about their work-life balance, which is on a par or even better with the wider UK workforce. That was a positive one. Another one I was going to highlight really quickly is 76% of people believe that change leads to positive outcomes, but respondents are divided on implementation, effectiveness, and satisfaction with pace. And we've kind of touched a little bit on change today. So we haven't got time to go into all those. And I'd urge people to read the report because it's really easy to read, to digest, and to use as a tool for kind of thinking about how organizations do stuff, what their own practice is and isn't doing in terms of its contribution to well-being. And one of you outlined 4 key questions that leaders need to be asking, which I think are a really good thing just to highlight as we kind of wrap up, is how do our organizational structures affect well-being? Are we developing systems that allow people to do their best work? Does our leadership approach build psychological safety or undermine it? And do we develop leaders to consider the person, not just the task? And they're 4 really powerful questions, which I think are brilliant.
Oh, well, it's nice to hear. It's high praise indeed coming from you, Lisa. But yeah, we really wanted to help people just get behind some of one of the challenges whenever you stop to reflect on anything is knowing where to start.
Mm,
Broader, open questions that got people thinking about leadership a little bit differently, and how they can create an environment where their leaders can thrive and build a better system, which will deliver better results and better well-being. So
yeah.
hopefully, if people do download the report, they will start to think that way themselves.
Yeah, well, we'll put the link to the report and your contact details and everything in the show notes so we can that will all be there. Just to wrap up this conversation, I want to just read a paragraph that you used it to conclude the report that I think is really, really powerful. You said workers are waiting for leaders who understand that well-being, performance, and organisational effectiveness are inseparably linked. What conversations will you start today? How will your leadership team respond to these insights? The opportunity's never been clearer, and the benefits for individuals, organisations, and communities have never been more achievable, which is a brilliant way, I think, to sum up your report, but sum up this conversation and sum up what people need to do when they're thinking about the well-being of their employees. So, Rich, thank you so much. That has whizzed by, but predictably brilliant as always. Chatting to you, and yeah, thank you so very much for the conversation today.
Thank you for the invite. Look forward to seeing you soon.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen. And please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates with your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but sometimes find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. If you're listening to this in autumn 2025, then keep them peeled for my brand spanking new website that's coming soon. Be sure to check it out. It's timeforchange.co.uk to find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join my mailing list to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my new retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture, and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to the next episode coming soon. Join me then.